Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something I know a lot of you have probably thought about.
Yeah,
Is frequent eating good for you,
right.
bad for you, or
Mm,
somewhere in between?
yeah. It's a real mystery.
It is. It's a nutritional mystery.
It is.
And to guide us through this mystery,
Mm-hmm.
we are turning to Overcoming Binge Eating by
Yeah.
Dr. Christopher Fairburn,
Uh,
who is a leading expert in the field. And now you might be thinking, wait, binge eating?
right.
What does that have to do with frequent eating?
Mm.
But trust me, this book has some really interesting insights about eating habits in general,
Yes, absolutely.
whether you struggle with binge eating or not.
To really understand those habits, we need to define what binge eating is.
Yeah,
It's more than just overindulging or having a big meal.
right.
Dr. Fairburn breaks it down into two key elements. First, consuming what feels like an excessive amount of food.
Okay.
And second, feeling like you've lost control over your eating during that episode.
That loss of control part is what I find so fascinating. It's
Yeah.
like your rational brain takes a back seat and you're just driven by this urge to keep eating.
Yeah, you just keep going.
Yeah, and there's a misconception that binge eating is all about carbs.
Right.
But actually, Dr. Fairburn points out that it's really about the overall amount of food consumed, not the specific food
And
group.
not about the food, it's about the quantity.
So it's not like your body has like some internal carbometer
Right.
that goes off and triggers a binge.
Exactly.
It's more about exceeding like a certain,
Threshold.
calorie threshold, regardless of whether those calories come from pizza or pretzels.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The composition of binges can actually change over time,
Oh,
often reflecting current dietary trends.
I love this.
Yes.
Dr. Fairburn mentions that back in the low-fat craze when everyone was terrified of fat,
Mm-hmm.
binges were often loaded with sweet, fatty foods.
Yeah.
It was almost like people were rebelling against the restrictions they were putting on themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
It was so interesting.
That's a perfect example of how societal influences can shape our eating habits.
Totally.
Even the unhealthy ones.
Okay, so now let's bring this back to the idea of frequent eating
Mm-hmm.
and how it impacts our bodies.
Okay.
One thing that really stood out to me in the book is that our body weight naturally fluctuates throughout the day.
Oh, yeah.
Have you noticed that?
Absolutely. And those fluctuations are primarily due to changes in hydration levels,
Okay.
not actual fat gain or loss.
Got it.
It's a crucial point because those short-term changes on the scale can really mess with our heads
Yeah,
if we're not careful.
It's so easy to see the scale go up a pound or two and panic,
Oh, yeah.
thinking you've suddenly gained fat,
Right.
but it's usually just water weight.
Usually it's just water.
Right, and this brings us to the whole concept of weight loss diets,
Okay.
which by design
Mm-hmm.
create an energy imbalance. You're consuming fewer calories than you're burning,
Right.
which can be healthy if you're overweight,
Sure.
but it can backfire in some cases.
It can.
This is where it gets tricky, because Dr. Fairburn explains that overly restrictive dieting can actually increase the likelihood of binge eating.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
When you consider how adaptable our bodies are,
Uh-huh.
when you severely restrict calories,
Okay.
your body goes into a sort of survival mode,
Oh,
which can trigger intense cravings
I see.
and make you more vulnerable to those out-of-control eating episodes.
It's like you're setting yourself up for a fall.
Mm-hmm.
You deprive yourself, then inevitably cave to those cravings
Right.
and end up overindulging.
Classic rebound effect.
And speaking of rebound effects,
Yes.
there's a common myth about yo-yo dieting,
Mm-hmm.
permanently damaging your metabolism.
All right.
Dr. Fairburn addresses this in the book as well.
He does.
So you're saying that all those warnings about my metabolism slowing down forever if I go on and off diets, they're not entirely true.
The science doesn't support it.
Okay, so it's not a life sentence for a sluggish metabolism
Yeah.
if you've struggled with dieting in the past.
Not at all. Your metabolism is much more resilient than you might think.
That's reassuring. So we've talked about the physiological side of things,
Mm-hmm.
but now I want to delve into the psychological aspects of eating habits,
Okay.
which Dr. Fairburn explores in depth in his book.
Yeah.
This is where it gets really intriguing.
Yeah, for sure.
I think this is where we can all really relate. So you're saying that binge eating isn't just about the food itself.
Right.
It's often tied to our emotions.
It is, absolutely. One of the core insights from Dr. Fairburn's work is that binge eating often serves as a way to cope with negative emotions.
Like emotional eating, but taken to the extreme.
Exactly. And the problem is that it creates this vicious cycle.
Uh-huh.
You feel bad, so you binge eat to try to feel better.
Right.
but then you end up feeling even worse afterward because of the guilt and shame, which can then trigger more emotional eating, so it's this trap.
Yeah, it's a trap it's hard to break free from.
Very difficult.
And to understand this trap, Dr. Fairburn introduces this really interesting concept.
Yes.
Called overconcern with shape and weight.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses a pie chart analogy.
He does.
To illustrate this.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm picturing a pie chart in my mind.
Yeah.
What does it look like for someone who has this overconcern?
Imagine a pie chart where a huge slice, maybe even the majority of the pie, is dedicated to body image.
Okay.
That leaves very little room for other important values like relationships, personal growth, career aspirations.
So it's like their whole sense of self-worth is wrapped up in how they look.
Exactly. And that can lead to some pretty unhealthy behaviors, like constantly checking their body for flaws.
Ah, yes. Shape checking.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Fairburn talks about how that can actually make things worse, right?
Absolutely. When you're hyper-focused on finding flaws, you're almost guaranteed to find them.
Oh, yeah.
Even if they're minor or imagined,
right.
It's like looking at yourself under a microscope. Any perceived imperfection is magnified.
It's easy to get caught in that spiral.
It is, and it's important to recognize that these body image concerns often go hand in hand with binge eating.
So someone might binge eat to try to numb the anxiety they feel about their body, but then they engage in shape checking,
right,
which just triggers more anxiety.
Exactly.
And the cycle continues.
It's this complex interplay of psychological and behavioral factors.
Now, Dr. Fairburn also discusses a specific condition.
Yes.
Called binge eating disorder, or a BED.
Right.
Can you tell us more about that?
BED is a recognized eating disorder that is distinct from bulimia or anorexia.
Okay.
It's characterized by recurrent episodes of binge eating, but without the purging behaviors like vomiting or laxative use that you see in bulimia.
So with BED, it's really about that loss of control during those eating episodes?
Yes.
But not necessarily about extreme measures to control weight.
That's right. And the causes of BED seem to be different from other types of binge eating problems. It appears to be more closely linked to stress and emotional regulation than to dieting.
That makes sense. Binge eating can be a way to temporarily escape from overwhelming feelings.
Exactly. And that's why addressing the underlying emotional issues is such a crucial part of treating BED.
Okay, so we've talked about the science, the psychology, the disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get to the part I know a lot of you are waiting for.
Yeah.
What can you actually do to gain control over binge eating?
Right.
Or, frankly, any unhealthy eating patterns?
Yeah.
Thankfully, Dr. Fairburn's book is full of practical strategies.
It is.
That we can apply.
One of the core strategies he emphasizes is establishing a pattern of regular eating.
Okay.
Which means having 3 meals and 2 to 3 snacks per day.
So it's not about starving yourself.
Right.
It's about creating a consistent and balanced eating schedule.
Exactly. And this regularity helps reduce the likelihood of binging for a couple of key reasons.
Okay.
First, it prevents the buildup of that intense physical and psychological pressure to eat that can often lead to a binge.
Because when you're constantly depriving yourself, your body goes into that survival mode we talked about earlier. And those cravings become almost impossible to resist.
Right. And second, regular eating helps to break the association between intense emotions and food.
So it's like you're retraining your brain to not automatically rely on food as the primary way to cope with difficult feelings.
Precisely. And Dr. Fairburn also provides some great tips for handling food cravings when they inevitably arise.
He talks about identifying alternative activities that are active, enjoyable, and realistic. What are some examples of those?
Think of it as building a toolbox of coping strategies that you can turn to instead of food.
Okay, I like that.
It could be going for a walk, listening to music, calling a friend, engaging in a hobby.
Right.
Anything that helps you ride out those urges without giving in.
He even mentions this technique called urge surfing.
Yes.
Which sounds pretty cool. Explain what that is.
Urge surfing is all about acknowledging the craving without judgment and then simply letting it pass. It's like watching a wave roll in and then roll back out again without getting swept away by it.
So it's essentially a mindfulness technique where you observe the urge without giving into it.
Exactly. And that can be a really powerful way to loosen the grip that cravings have over you.
Dr. Fairburn also provides a really helpful problem-solving framework for dealing with difficult situations that might trigger a binge.
He breaks it down into 6 clear steps.
Okay, hit me with the 6 steps.
Define the problem, brainstorm possible solutions, evaluate the pros and cons of each solution.
Go.
Choose the best solution, implement the solution, and review how it went.
It's like having a step-by-step guide
Mm-hmm.
for navigating those tricky moments without resorting to food.
It's a very practical and empowering approach.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have.
But before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more important point from Dr. Fairbairn's book.
Okay.
From Dr. Fairbairn's book that I think a lot of us can relate to. He talks about setbacks and how to handle them. You know, those moments when you slip up.
Right.
Maybe even have a full-blown binge despite your best efforts.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that without getting totally derailed?
That's such an important point, and it's something that Dr. Fairbairn addresses directly in his book. He emphasizes that setbacks are a normal part of the process.
Okay.
We're all human,
Right.
and change doesn't happen overnight.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about being resilient.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that you're human, you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay.
Right.
The key is to not let those mistakes define you or derail your progress.
Easier said than done, though, right?
It is.
I think a lot of us struggle with that feeling of guilt and shame when we slip up,
Right.
especially when it comes to food.
I understand it's a very common response, but Dr. Fairbairn offers a really helpful reframing of setbacks. He encourages us to view them as learning opportunities rather than failures.
So instead of beating ourselves up, when we have a binge or overindulge, we should try to understand what triggered it, what we could have done differently, and how we can prevent it from happening again.
Exactly. It's about approaching those setbacks with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment and self-criticism.
That makes a lot of sense. And he makes a distinction between a lapse and a relapse, right?
Yes, a lapse is a temporary slip-up, a momentary deviation from your plan. A relapse, on the other hand, is a full-blown return to old patterns.
So having a single binge wouldn't necessarily be considered a relapse?
Not necessarily. It depends on the context. If you have a single binge after months of consistent progress, that's likely just a lapse.
Okay.
It doesn't mean you failed or that you have to start all over again.
That's reassuring to hear. So what's the best way to handle a setback, whether it's a lapse or a relapse? What does Dr. Fairbairn recommend?
He outlines a few key steps. One, spot the problem early.
Okay.
The sooner you recognize that you're struggling, the easier it will be to course correct. 2, don't give up.
Don't give up.
A setback doesn't mean you failed. It just means you need to adjust your approach. And 3, reactivate the strategies that have worked for you in the past. You've already come so far. You have a toolbox of coping skills and strategies that have helped you in the past.
Right.
Don't be afraid to use them again.
It's like having a plan in place for those inevitable bumps in the road. You know, they're coming, so you might as well be prepared. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key message we want our listeners to take away?
I think the most important takeaway is that our relationship with food is incredibly complex.
Okay.
It's influenced by so many factors: biology, psychology, social influences, cultural norms.
Right.
It's not a simple equation, but no matter how complicated it might seem, we all have the power to make positive changes and develop a healthier, more balanced way of eating.
It's empowering to remember that we have more control than we sometimes realize.
Absolutely. And it's a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs, but with the right tools and support, we can all move toward a more peaceful and joyful relationship with food.
I love that it's about progress, not perfection. And speaking of progress, as you go about your day-to-day, take a moment to reflect on your own relationship with food, what's working well, where are you struggling, what are some small changes you can make to move toward a healthier, happier place. Maybe it's time to try out some of Dr. Fairbairn's strategies, like establishing a more regular eating pattern, building a toolbox of coping skills, or practicing urge surfing. And remember, if you're struggling, don't hesitate to reach out for professional support. You deserve to have a peaceful and joyful relationship with food, and there's help available to get you there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time,